So I call this next one the people that were basically living within the borders, the territorial borders of the United States, but were really exiled and kept out of political power, voting rights restricted, if not completely eliminated, and people that were not really, for all intents and purposes, considered part of the American nation. People that were viewed as outsiders or others, and who are largely victimized in a whole lot of different ways, militarily, economically, socially. So the three major groups I want to go through and give a short kind of discussion about in the late 1800s are Native Americans, African Americans, and the new immigrants. The immigrants coming from Eastern and Southern Europe. So each of these were basically living in the territorial United States, but were not considered real Americans, were not protected by law most of the time. They were shunned and kind of kept on the periphery of American society. So first, the so-called Indian Wars, as a lot of textbooks call them, that grew out of the kind of natural result of colonization, from going all the way back into the early 1600s, when the English and the French and the Dutch started to arrive in the original, what came to be known as the 13 colonies that eventually create the original United States. There was a lot of hope amongst Europeans that these natives would, accept the Europeans somehow, accept the colonizing power, and give over land and resources and whatnot, and really help out. Not a very realistic expectation. So this is a pretty optimistic portrayal of the meetings between European leaders, colonists, and natives who wondered why they were trying to take their land. A lot of times the Europeans looked down on the natives, and the term Indian comes from a geographic mistake. Basically, Columbus thought that when he landed in the Caribbean, he had landed somewhere around India, and he called the darker-skinned peoples he saw Indians, and it gets perpetuated on down through the centuries. But the natives lived in a very different way, especially economically. The natives largely did not divide up land according to personal property. They occupied lands communally, and they considered land to be a resource for the community that they did not want to parcel up into individual little plots and then buy and sell amongst each other all the time for profit. They viewed land and natural resources as a kind of gift of the earth that should not be misused or abused or wasted. And they really are major kind of conservationists. They understand that if you destroy the land, if you plant too much over too long a period of time, you're going to get less crops over time, so it's just not a wise idea to try to overproduce things, or to slaughter too many of the animals to the point where they can't really regenerate their populations, because that's going to hurt you in the long term. Natives understood this, and they obviously had their own religious ideas, largely polytheistic in a lot of ways, worshipping a lot of kind of ancient ideas about the gods of nature, gods of rain and sunshine and hurricanes and all that kind of stuff. And that was also hugely offensive to the Europeans who landed, with very strict views of Christianity a lot of times. A lot of Europeans landed and expected to be able to convert natives to Christianity one way or another. And when the natives resisted, they labeled the natives savages, backward peoples who are too ignorant and too dangerous, living like animals out there in the forest, and are easy victims for European colonization. So those kinds of racist imagery amongst the Europeans filters down into the original U.S. government. And there are racist statements in the U.S. Declaration of Independence, even, where it proclaims the freedom and equality of all men, or in what Jefferson probably would have said today is all humans. Specifically also said that the king is guilty of releasing the savages upon us, so we have the right to rebel against the king. So there's a lot of racism dominant in the early kind of U.S. government documents, the foundational documents of the U.S. federal government. And these ideas keep on going on, and they become very problematic because the European, eventually U.S. leaders don't just stay along the coastline. They start expanding gradually westward. By the time that the Civil War begins, the United States inhabits what we today call the continental U.S. Has moved from the eastern seaboard colonies all the way to the Mississippi River, and then all the way into the plains. By the early 1800s, they buy all this land from France. And then they invade what was Mexico in the 1840s and conquer land all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So by the time we walk into this class in 1865 or so, the United States stretches from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. They claim all that territory as the United States. But there are still a lot of native tribes. In the early 1800s, they have been pushed away from the Appalachian Mountains across the Mississippi and out into the Great Plains. And really, after the Civil War, the last remaining powerful tribes in the United States are located in the Great Plains, Nebraska, Colorado, Kansas, up into the Dakotas. And as the U.S. population continues moving westward and building more and more cities and large towns out in these plains, the big military conflicts with natives continue happening. And the most powerful tribe in the plains were the Sioux. They were the most warlike. Most native tribes are agricultural in a lot of ways. They raise food for their own survival. The Sioux relied largely on hunting, especially the large buffalo herds. So they were master horsemen. They knew how to ride and shoot, so they were naturally good warriors if they ever decided to resist. And they do in the late 1800s. Many Sioux tribes, many different groups choose to try to fight back. And eventually the United States will send in the U.S. Army to destroy these tribes whenever they resist and convince the rest to give up without a fight. The U.S. government creates a system, one step after another, to eradicate native tribal power, especially in the plains. The first step is going after the major source of Sioux survival in the plains, and that was the buffalo herd. The Sioux especially relied on the buffalo hunt. It was an ancestral thing. It became a part of their religion even. And also, when they killed buffalo, they used every single piece of that carcass that they possibly could. They didn't try to waste anything at all. And the buffalo herds were massive in the plains. Thousands and thousands in one herd alone. And they just wandered. And that's why the Sioux kind of culturally, religiously, and just for their own kind of economic sustenance relied on those herds because they regenerated quickly, and the Sioux were careful enough to not completely wipe them out. And the U.S. government understood how closely they relied on the herd, so the U.S. government policy becomes to wipe them out. Kill as many buffalo as possible, therefore destroy the economic and social basis of the Sioux tribes, and remove probably the biggest military threat, the militant threat that the natives could bring against the U.S. farmers and frontiersmen who were moving into the plains at the time. So their number one policy early on, right after the Civil War, is to destroy the buffalo herds. The U.S. Army gets involved in doing this, slaughtering them as many as they can get, and they just allow the carcasses to waste out in the plains. They don't really care about using the dead buffalo for much of anything. They just want to kill as many as possible. They also pay companies, U.S. businesses, to go into the plains and kill as many buffalo as possible because the businesses are in it to make money. They accept government payments to go off and do this. And they also take advantage of the buffalo by largely cutting off their hides. And at this point in U.S. and European history, buffalo hide is becoming a kind of popular fur, a popular kind of manufactured product. So the more hides they get, they can sell for a great profit. And these are not just the carcasses of buffalo. These are the actual hides, the actual skin. So you can see just mountains of them are piled up on the sites of mass buffalo slaughters. And you get many of these kinds of images. And this became a kind of government policy. They outsourced this sometimes from the U.S. Army and just hired private companies to go do this stuff. And the Sioux tribes are largely heavily damaged because their economic basis, is being destroyed. The rug is being pulled out from under them. So, questions about any of that so far? And this is real economic warfare. The next major step that we know of, and we know about this from high government sources and archival research, the U.S. government then moved to buy out the natives, go into the areas that they are occupying, and basically try to buy the land from them and get them to sign treaties to go to specifically reserved territories for natives to stay, to live, where they won't be bothered by U.S. frontiersmen or pioneers or any new farmers who want to move into the plains. So they set aside these supposedly reservations, these reserved lands, and some of them are pretty large lands, to relocate natives to areas that will be far away from the general American population. Usually these reservations, you can tell by the map, are located in not very, very favorable conditions. There's a whole lot of them. Oklahoma is built as a native territory to be mostly a reservation. If you've ever been to Oklahoma, it's a far different experience from anywhere else in the Midwest where fruit grows easily. Oklahoma is largely a desert. And you can see the next largest areas are in Arizona. Again, if you've ever been to Arizona, you know what that's about. So you get the dispersal of native tribes, and they try to relocate them and centralize native tribes in smaller areas and open up the rest of the Midwest to, white European-style development of land ownership, individual ownership over property. A lot of tribes were willing to do this because they understood that resisting against the U.S. Army could be a suicide mission. So a lot of them made deals with the U.S. government to accept reservations as long as the U.S. government promised to give funding to the reservation government and to give them, say, food and water and clothes and build schools and stuff like that. And so the U.S. government leaders thought that that was a great bargain. So they signed those deals. And a lot of the native tribes left the plains and went to their reservations. The tribes on the reservations are theoretically considered foreign countries under the treaties. So the treaties signed with Washington, D.C. say that if you are on one of these reservations, you are in a different country, you have to follow their laws. They have their own foreign policies. They have their own taxation ideas, and that largely holds true today. So oftentimes when like federal marshals or someone would want to go into a reservation to arrest someone for committing crimes in the United States, they have to contact the reservation leaders, ask permission, or ask them to go arrest the person. These kinds of things still hold true today? Yes, very largely. Which raises a great question, at least in my mind. The state of California taxes these reservations, right? Specifically the casinos, to get tax revenue for the state. How is that acceptable if they're a foreign country? So, personally, every time I see one of those propositions, I vote against it because it's theoretically impossible. But how does California get away with doing this? Because the reservations didn't sign treaties with Sacramento. They signed them with Washington, D.C. So it's illegal for the federal government to tax them, but the individual state governments try to get away with it.
Are they still getting funding from the U.S. government?
They did get some funding, but it usually ended up being pretty bad. Because the U.S. government is corrupt, they hire companies to provide food and clothing and whatnot to the native reservations. And so they sign government contracts to provide, say, a bunch of clothes or build houses for the natives. And just like companies do today, when they get government contracts, they'll get as much money as they can and put out the shoddiest, crappiest product as possible. Because the more money you spend on making a good building, the less money you have for profit, right? So they take the contract, they keep as much money for themselves, and build the crappiest, run-down building that they can possibly get away with. And because the U.S. government is corrupt, they don't really punish these companies, so it becomes a systematic thing. What did the natives think about that? They were none too happy with it, because they realized that they've been sold out. And they complain about it, and because U.S. society is so heavily racist, then in a lot of ways today, a lot of Americans just say, well, you got what you wanted, then shut up. I don't really care about your complaints. Handle it yourself. So this becomes another source of systematic corruption. And specifically in Grant's administration, when a lot of this stuff gets going, right after the Civil War ends, he creates an office from the White House called the Office of Indian Affairs to really run all this infrastructure stuff. And they appointed a good, upstanding Christian guy who talked about reform and equality and all this stuff, and talked about education for the natives. And when it's revealed that his company was selling whiskey to the natives, which is a pretty unchristian and uneducational thing to do, that just was one more scandal that Grant had to deal with. So there's systematic corruption that really kills the efficiency and the effectiveness of a lot of these contracts that are signed. When the natives realize that these contracts are going bad, a lot of natives start to resist. They say, why should I go to a reservation if I'm going to get the bad end of the deal economically? I'm going to be sent to some place in the desert or some very unvaluable land, and I'm not even going to get the benefits of the deal. I'm going to get pretty much sold out by the corrupt American government. So a lot of tribes do start militantly resisting. They try to stay on their land, and that turned out to be a dangerous thing, because the major leaders of the U.S. federal government after the Civil War are the major generals who led the Civil War. They are the most popular politicians in the next few decades. So Grant goes into office first, and then Hayes. And really until the 1890s, almost the high political leadership of the U.S. has a history of being in the Army. So they have experience with warfare, and they know how to use violence to get what they want. And a lot of generals in the U.S. Army realized that with the end of the Civil War, the next major conflict that the United States would fight would probably be against native tribes. So a lot of them asked for being stationed out in the West because they wanted to be at the head of the next fight. So there is a large amount of just straight out military repression that becomes the third level of U.S. kind of formal policy to break native power and to push them around and get what you want from them. And you can see, a lot of these guys, as many generals do, they have a pretty stern look on their face. They don't put up with a lot of argument or criticism. They're the tough guys. Probably the biggest and most famous battle, and really the biggest native victory, is called the Battle of Little Bighorn. Basically, the U.S. Army was sent out to deal with a certain tribe up in the Dakota territories, where you see the red dot up there in what is today Montana. This happens in 1876, and in the spring and early summer of 76. So the U.S. Army is sent forward to deal with a native kind of uprising problem. The advanced scout of this army is led by a guy named George Custer. And if you ever study George Custer's history, he was a very vain person who is obsessed with his own image and wants to win a big battle, most likely to get into politics. He wants to become famous. And he takes some pretty big risks. He really thinks of himself as a military genius. So he hires some native scouts who know the area well, because he's just entering the area. He doesn't know the lay of the land very well. He doesn't know where to fight, where a good defensive position is, or anything like that. So he hires some native scouts, pays them, and they kind of direct him and his advance kind of regiment up toward where they believe the natives are. They point out where this tribe is kind of over the hill, and they say, well, they have a good defensive position, you probably don't want to attack. Custer says, yeah, right, we're the U.S. Army, we'll do whatever we want. So he rejects their advice, then splits his army into 4 different pieces, which obviously weakens each of them, and attacks from 4 different sides, and it appears that the natives knew that he was going to attack. So this turns into a complete native victory, and Custer and his force are wiped out. Word of this military debacle goes back to Washington, D.C., right on the week of the 100th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So this is right in the middle of a giant national celebration. Bad news hits, and people are pissed off and worried and ashamed. Custer is presented as a Greek hero, even though it's really his fault that this happened. It's a bad mistake. And the U.S. Army is sent forward with even more troops, and they deal with this native uprising. Basically, the American population is so angered by this stuff that they don't want to take any prisoners. And with a lot of native customs, sometimes when they don't want to take prisoners of war, they largely execute their prisoners, and they scalp them for their own cultural reasons, which a lot of American people saw as the most savage and horrible way to kill somebody, especially a prisoner. So there's a lot of racist ideology going around about, these barbarians deserve what they get, right? And that's a pretty common theme going through U.S. politics. There's sayings in U.S. society that the only good Indian is a dead one. And you tend to get those kinds of labels being applied to national enemies in one way or another. Happens with Germans in World War I, with the Russians in the Cold War, Vietnamese when the U.S. invades South Vietnam, 1965. And since September 11th, there's been a lot of violence against Muslim communities. As we saw last month when, one specific idiot didn't even know what really a Muslim was and went and shot up a different community. But this kind of racist perspective tends to grow in what a lot of Americans consider some kind of national emergency. Okay, so the Battle of Little Bighorn is a disaster. And the military repression increases, and that really convinces a lot of tribes that they should give up, because fighting against the U.S. Army, even if you win a battle, they're just going to come back in much more massive numbers and destroy you. So after that, a lot of native tribes willingly go to the reservations, and therefore a lot of U.S. strategy goes for a military repression, because that was pretty successful, to what to do when they get to the reservations. And a lot of the U.S. policy becomes re-education. Once you get them onto the reservations, you build schools and houses for them. You divide up their lands according to private property. So a lot of these native reservations are divided up, and a lot of native families got their own kind of little chunk of land, like how Europeans run their land economically. They divide it up and sell it one to another. And the re-education really hits in the native schools. U.S.-built schools that go in to teach so-called white ways of living. Christianity, English, private property, which are really exact opposites of a lot of ways that native culture had historically operated.
Why did the U.S. always think that it's good for them to force their way of...
Well, because they thought they were barbarians. They consider natives to be just like as they will consider Africans when they go to Africa, and a lot of people when they go to South and East Asia. A lot of these people are living out in the forest. They're not wearing many clothes. They are worshiping non-Christian gods. They are slaughtering each other. They are executing prisoners. They show no ability to understand the value of private property. U.S. leaders and Western culture in general views itself with a great amount of superiority. Western culture had created the worldwide explorations, had created the big boats to do the sailing. They had created the Industrial Revolution that's making all the clothes. They had created what they see as better food supply. They think that they have found the secret. Western scientists think that they have solved the major problems of humankind. And the native tribes and natives throughout the world that were not close to these kinds of achievements were very much looked down upon. And the only way to make their societies better was to bring them closer to your own development, right? To teach them how to be like a European. To lift them up to a higher standard of living. And you see a lot of these attempts still happening today in places like Iraq or Afghanistan, where you try to rebuild their societies to mirror yours, even though they have thousands of years of history of operating in their own way. Changing thousands of years of history and cultural inheritance is very difficult to do in 10 years, with $1 trillion even. Specifically, there is one law passed by the federal government called the Dawes Act, which tries to force individual ownership of property, specifically land, onto the natives on reservations. And it had disastrous effects. Because when the natives are forced to accept this private property kind of, little, you wouldn't call it suburban, but, cut up into little farms that each family owns, and they have the right to sell it. They have so little experience in market economics that when they're offered a little bit of money for their land, they take it. So native land ownership in Oklahoma in 1885, when this law hits and goes into effect, just a few years later, a lot of it is sold very quickly. And you see how much is left in 1891, just kind of down here in the corner. So just a few years later, the big investors, the big American investment companies, who know that they can get away with offering what seemed to the natives a lot of money for a quick purchase. They went in and did it, and a lot of big investment companies went in and bought up a huge amount of territory in Oklahoma for dirt cheap prices. Does this still happen today? Absolutely. Especially in inner city areas, you'll drive around and you'll see billboards that say cash for your home. And they'll give you $60,000 or something for your house. If they buy up a lot of property, that land can be worth millions. So they're going in and buying things up for pennies, comparatively. Same thing happens here. So questions about any of that? Yep.
Have they restored any reservations after all of it?
Not that I know of. I haven't done a ton of research into this. The story with Oklahoma is that a lot of white Americans move in and start running their own farms and businesses and whatnot, to the point where Oklahoma is not nearly as much a reservation as it used to be.
My grandma grew up on one of the reservations in Oklahoma.
Yep.
And she will talk about how everything.
Yep. And it becomes pretty unpopular with the natives because over time they realize how economically victimized they are and they're not very happy about it. And they start a social movement to gather back together and try to remember a lot of their ancestral teachings and a lot of their ancestral philosophies on life and their communal interactions. They do this largely because a lot of their children are being forced to go to these reservation schools where they're being taught Christianity and English and how a lot of the native traditions are absolutely wrong, and trying to basically Europeanize these people or Americanize them. When the children go home from the school and they sit in the home for the rest of the day, do they continue speaking English? No, because the parents don't want that. The parents want to teach their children their native culture to continue it into the future. But this was an attempt at what we call cultural imperialism. You conquer an area, you force the population to learn your way of living, and you wipe out their cultural memory. And that's a big debate still happening today. I mean, in a lot of Spanish-speaking communities, the children are forced to go and learn English in the schools, and then they go back home and speak Spanish and continue with their own cultural heritage because the parents want to do it that way. And there's not much government can do to really stop it. but there are big attempts to wipe out so-called un-American practices. And we're seeing it with a movement to make English the official language of the country and try to wipe out all their access to other languages in official government documents and whatnot. We call that nativism, which means the white Native Americans, to use that term, the Americans that are born into American citizenship are often very angry about what they see as lesser races or lesser cultures, and they want to get rid of them. And that movement is still powerful today. But a lot of these native groups come back together and they hold festivals and they hold rituals in their communities to try to keep their cultural ideas alive. Probably the most powerful one and the most widespread one from one reservation to another becomes known as the ghost dance, where they would gather together at night and they would, they believed, commune. They would talk with their ancestors who had passed away, who had died sometimes hundreds of years before, to get advice on how to deal with these white people that are destroying their culture. You know, what did you try that didn't work? Maybe we'll try to avoid doing that stuff. So this is much more a cultural thing for passing culture on to the next generation, keeping it alive. The U.S. government, though, looks at this as these people meeting in secret in the middle of the night. They're holding these funky rituals that look militaristic, so they view it as a military threat. So the U.S. Army is sent back in to destroy the ghost dance movement. More images. And the natives resist because they see this as one of their last chances to keep their culture alive. Probably the biggest so-called battle happens at Wounded Knee up in the Dakota territories that eventually become states. The U.S. Army and a lot of American textbooks call this a battle. It was not a battle, it was a massacre. The U.S. Army lined up. And there were some natives from this local group who also had guns, were far outnumbered and far outgunned. And when they were told to put their guns down and surrender, supposedly a shot went off, and the Americans just started shooting every native they found, including women and children. So you see, this happened late in the year, in the winter time. So a lot of the victims who didn't die from the gunshot wounds died from freezing to death. And as the American soldiers in the background, sat around waiting for these people to die, they took pictures. Because picture taking was a big fad of accurate and reliable photography is very much a creation of the late 1800s. And portable camera kinds of machines. So you get a lot of these different kinds of images, and the massacre is pretty widespread throughout that whole community. And they literally killed just about everybody that they found. And some people who took pictures wrote down, what this is an image of, and sent it back home or sent it to newspapers or something like this. Okay. All right, now getting to African Americans. So the Native repression is pretty clear-cut and obvious, and we have a lot of sources that describe this as an official government policy in a lot of ways. An unofficial government policy, at least on the federal level, was the repression of black people throughout the country. The Constitution had been amended to make slavery illegal, to make former slaves into citizens protected by law. And the amendment that made them into citizens also said that any person living in U.S. territory is protected equally by the law, not just citizens. And that's an important thing to remember. And the Third Amendment, the Third Reconstruction Amendment, made all those citizens into real voters, at least the men, adult men. They could theoretically go and vote. So the federal government said that this was going to be national law. But as we talked about during the talk on Reconstruction, these laws were only really implemented where the U.S. Army occupied the South. And when the U.S. Army withdrew in 1877, the occupation ended. the black vote really disappears through several different ways: economic repression and internal terrorist tactics, like things like the Ku Klux Klan. If a black person actually showed up and tried to vote, they may be hanged later that night, or their home may be burned, or their family may be attacked. And the murderers and the rapists and whatnot get away with it because they're often sheriffs and the local police, or they're mayors, or the people in charge of the local areas. So blacks were pretty heavily repressed, and we have a lot of statistics to prove it, and it's pretty non-controversial perspective in the late 1800s. Some black people were able to rise up to fame and education, usually by being helped by rich white people. So not all white people in the United States were so heavily racist that they, by default hated blacks and wanted to keep them down forever. There were some decent white people who understood that the victory in the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln's grand vision of freedom had to be continually fought. And a lot of, especially northern wealthy white people, took talented black children and educated them. And this guy, Booker T. Washington, was one of those. He was born in 1856 as a slave, was freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. It was read to him and other slaves on a farm by the U.S. Army when they came through the local area. So he was 9 years old at that point. After the war, he went north, eventually wound up in West Virginia. And some wealthy white landowners recognized that he was a smart kid, and they paid for his schooling. And he realizes that if black people are not going to get real political equality and freedom, if they're not going to get voting powers or the protection of law, that at the very least they should be able to get schools to at least learn how to read and write and understand things on an intellectual level. So that maybe sometime in the future they could do something for their own empowerment. So he went back into the South and established schools for black children and black adults. And he called them industrial schools. Basically, they're not big philosophical schools that teach a lot of Western philosophy and debates on God or anything like that. They teach industrial arts, which means let's see, what would we call it today? Manual labor, trade schools. And they're basically trade schools. How do you work on machines? How do you work in factories? Those kinds of things. And his schools were fairly successful. Usually they were donated or paid for by rich white people from other areas, especially from the north. But they did churn out graduates who were pretty well educated, and they were capable of doing meaningful work for a decent wage, if that wage was offered. So Washington became a kind of symbol of black empowerment, but also working within the white repressive system. So he was invited to Atlanta to give a speech by Southern leaders about how black people could operate within the system and eventually make money for themselves and empower themselves. So he gives a speech that he calls the bargain, that historically has become known as the Atlanta Compromise. And the bargain means, and he says so in this speech, that the policy for black people should be to achieve economic power first. Basically, get educated, get the best job you can, save money. And when you have enough money saved over the decades, maybe then black leaders can rise and push for full civil, political, and social equality. And he says that the road to this will have to be cooperation with the white elite. They have to work together. He says that white people and black people in this industrial revolution that's hitting the United States are like fingers on the same hand. They may do different jobs. They may be separate theoretically, but they are all connected economically. And that black people have to realize this. And he tells his almost entirely white audience that instead of hating black people, to hire them. Instead of hiring immigrants from foreign countries, hire your local workers. And he says because black people, especially the South, are at least half the population at that point, that you will build up the South to be a powerful economic engine just like the North, where most of the big factories are being located. And that is what will pull the South out of depravity and poverty and a lot of these things. And again, he says, if the white owners are willing to hire black workers and give them a role in the economy, give them jobs that they can do, then there will be social stability. And black people will be so thankful for getting a job and making a wage and being able to save money that they will not immediately demand real equality. So, who do you think supported this plan? White owners. Because they realize that if this goes into effect, the black population will be silent about equality. And of course, if you just don't pay them that much, they probably won't be able to save the money anyway. And that's why it's called the compromise. Washington didn't call it the compromise. His critics, especially black leaders, called it a compromise. You are selling out their people, the whole society. And probably the biggest critic of this that rises in the early 1900s is a guy named Du Bois. And he writes a book called The Souls of Black Folk. And one chapter is extraordinarily powerful where he goes after Washington and says this isn't going to work. And you can tell by the title of the book, he wants blacks to be seen as human beings with souls. So he is pushing for equality with whites even in the title of the book. But in that chapter, he states pretty powerfully, economic power will not happen. The people that are being starved will never be able to gain real economic power because they just won't make enough money. So Washington's plan will not work. It will over time be a system of oppression. So Du Bois wants to flip it. He says the first thing you have to do is demand full civil and social and legal equality. You have to be protected by the laws before you're going to be able to really save anything. So he is diametrically opposed to Washington's idea. And Du Bois goes on into the 1900s. He lives into the 1960s, I believe. And for the rest of his life tries to push for full equality. And he is one of the major founders of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is still around today. And he is a powerful advocate for black equality. And he never gives up. He becomes a little embittered as he gets into older age, and he hasn't seen many real successes for equality. But early on, he is a very, very powerful force intellectually, and he writes books and he gives public speeches, travels throughout the country. So he is a very well-known figure in American politics and society in the early 1900s, at least. So, questions about those two different arguments?
So Washington wasn't using it as a tactic. He actually believed that blacks would avoid social power.
Yes.
When I first
He
saw
said
it,
you get the money first, and if you can pull enough money together, then you can start trying to win elections and trying to get something on the higher levels, on the political level.
Did that really work?
No. That's an open question. Did it work? Personally, I would argue not.
Yeah.
And we have income studies today that show that, on average, white families in the United States make 20 times the income. 20 times, not 20%. 20 times, on average, in the United States, that of black families. And I think it's 18 times the amount that Latino families make. So there is still some real structural problems here, right? And that's largely because the richest of the rich are usually white families. So the millionaire and billionaire class really skew that curve. If you take it down only to people making up to, say, $500,000 a year, it becomes much more equalized. Or not close to equal, but it gets closer to reasonable. But it's the really high-level ones that are way, way out there. And have we talked about how much money you have to make to be the richest 1% in this class? Yeah, a little over $400,000 if you look at IRS income tax returns statistically. Yeah, which again shows you how much poverty you have in this country. I thought it was going to be like 10 million or something over. No, it's pretty low. Okay. So now the new immigration. Again, this is a map of Europe. I wish I had a year. Germany. So this is in the late 1800s, after the 1870s. Germany is created into an actual country, a unified country in 1871. So this is after 1871. I wish I had an exact year for you, but I don't. So this is late 1870s going forward. This is what Europe looks like. And again, at first, the first major immigrants into the United States largely came from Northern and Western Europe, specifically England, that created the first original 13 colonies, Scotland, France had a lot of immigrants in what became known as Canada and west of the Mississippi River in Louisiana Territory, named after King Louis. So there's a lot of French also. There's a lot of Spanish in the area. And these all have pretty close ties to Western European culture, and specifically a lot of them know how to speak English. So it wasn't really a big deal for immigration to grow and grow and grow up until about the 1840s or so, because these people can assimilate into American culture pretty quickly. They speak the language, they understand the customs. It's not until really after the Civil War where immigration starts to shift to the poorer areas of Europe, notably the South, like Italy, Greece, and the East, Austria, Hungary, Poland. These people have very little connections to English, very small connections to historic British culture, and they are viewed as very different and untrustworthy. And there's a lot of different reasons for that mistrust. Number one, they come in and they show no willingness to actually learn English and learn American culture and become what we call Americanized. So again, there's a lot of nativism in the United States. American citizens that are born in the United States look down on these new immigrants as different. You often get these depictions of them as diseased and dirty and all kinds of things, because a lot of them were poor. And the reason that they're going to the United States, one reason, is that they are poor. They see little economic prospects for them in the places they grew up. They are desperate. That's why people usually move over large distances from one place to another. That in the United States is a booming economy. That's where jobs are. And whenever you get a lot of poorer people living in one area, if they see an opportunity to go to the rich area, they will go. They will climb over walls. They will do whatever they want. And we'll talk later in this class about people climbing over the Berlin Wall under threat of being shot on sight. They don't arrest you, they just shoot you to death. People still do it for decades. So those kind of things don't stop people when they're desperate. But when these people start coming to the United States, they are very much looked down upon. They start flooding into the major American cities. New York, Boston, especially the coastline cities, because that's where the boats landed first. Charleston, Philadelphia, New Orleans sometimes, but largely the East Coast cities. And these cities had to build major processing centers to bring these natives in, inspect them for disease, and ask them where they're from, try to get an address of maybe family members in the city so they have some kind of contact information for these people. And obviously, the political machines are the next step. They want to register all these people to vote, even though they might not speak English. You know, you bring them, if the politicians bring them in and say, well, if you sign up on my party, then I know where you can go stay for the night. I know where you can get food. And maybe I'll give you some whiskey or something to drink along the way. So that's really what voter registration looks like, especially in places like New York City or Boston. So a lot of these processing centers become very large, and they're located literally right along the harbors. And Ellis Island in New York City became the most famous. And there's a lot of depictions of it in the late 1800s. Of people literally just getting off the boat. And they start moving into lines to announce who they are, what their names are, where they're from, where they hope to go, if they have any relatives. All those kinds of things. And they are queued up. They are herded in there and forced to wait sometimes long periods of time. But the investigations by the Immigration Board weren't all that deep. It was usually like a 2-minute interview or something like that. They mostly were looking for disease, or if you're bringing in, fruits or something that could be dangerous to Native American plants or stuff like that. But mostly these immigrants were coming in with virtually nothing but the clothes on their back. So there's a lot of American racism against these people, especially because of the linguistic differences. And a lot of them, when they went into, say, New York City, if they're from Italy, they go to an Italian area of New York City where they mostly speak Italian. And Italian customs. They celebrate Italian Independence Day in the middle of New York City. And that offends a lot of Americans. Just like a lot of Americans are offended on like Cinco de Mayo or May 1st or something, when a lot of Mexican immigrants gather in big cities and they hold up Mexican flags, and a lot of Americans say it's horrible. That stuff continues. Probably one of the most ostracized groups become the Irish. Even though they're from Ireland, they speak a dialect of English sometimes, not all that intelligible by Americans. But the Irish come in droves starting in the 1840s, and it tapers off during the Civil War because no one wants to move in a war zone. And Irish immigration picks up again after the war is over. And again, they go into the big cities, they go into their own communities, they have their own kind of culture that keeps going. And a lot of businesses refuse to hire them. They become kind of the lowest of the low on the kind of immigrant ladder. And you get signs that say, no dogs are Irish allowed into bars or public buildings or something like that. When a company hires, they'll put a sign out that say, Irish need not apply. They're literally considered the lowest of the low, the least trustworthy, for a lot of different reasons. So since a lot of private businesses wouldn't hire Irish workers, a lot of them go to work for cities, because cities aren't supposed to have those kind of racist employment tactics. So a lot of the Irish go into be the kind of average daily workers for the city governments. They become trash collectors, firemen, policemen. And that kind of cultural thing continues where a lot of, even today, a lot of municipal workers are still Irish in the eastern cities, even as far west as Chicago. And St. Patrick's Day is usually a very big parade in a lot of these cities still. Why did a lot of Americans fear, especially the Irish? Number one, because U.S. foreign policy is starting to shift. The United States, ever since the Revolution, considered Great Britain to be the mortal enemy of everything that is good and pure in the world. They hated the British Empire. They hated what the British king had done to them. And they continue that hatred. They even fight another war against Britain in 1812 going into 1815. So there's a second war that the U.S. largely loses. So it's humiliating. So there's this deep hatred of Britain continues into the far future, into the late 1800s. And it's about that point where U.S. foreign policy starts to shift and British foreign policy starts to shift. They start recognizing more of the things they have in common, largely fear of Germany. And they start talking about burying the hatchet and getting together to work together for their common goals in the world. And that is a very hotly debated thing in the United States, and a lot of Americans are supportive of that. They say they trust the British much more than the Germans or the Russians or someone like that. The problem is that Britain had invaded Ireland in the 1600s and probably inflicted one of the more brutal invasions and occupations in recent human history. Really wiped out a lot of the Irish through starvation and plague and whatnot. It was really a horrible thing. So the Irish very much hate the British for a long, long time. And they start an independence movement against Britain, against the British Empire. And they start calling themselves the Irish Nationalist Movement. And eventually the most extremists call themselves the Irish Republicans. They want to create a Republic of Ireland, its own independent country. So they create what becomes known as the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, that launches assassinations and bombings in Britain to convince the British to give up and let Ireland become its own country. So there is a long-standing hatred between the Irish and the British. And when the Irish start flooding into the United States, a lot of Americans assume that the Irish will try to get into government and really poison the American attempt at becoming friends with Britain. Does that make sense? So there's a lot of movements to stop the Irish from voting in particular. Because the Irish, they think, will vote more for pro-Irish politicians than really trustworthy American politicians. Their loyalty lies with Ireland more than anything, but secondarily with the Pope, because a lot of Irish are Catholic. So there's a lot of fears of letting the Irish vote, letting the Irish run for office, and letting Catholics run for office in general. This idea that they have taken some kind of personal loyalty to the Pope, so they'll do whatever the Pope wants regardless of what's good for American foreign policy or American taxation or anything like that. And how many non-Protestant presidents has the United States ever had? One, at least recently. I mean, back and forth with people like Jefferson, Adams, or someone like that. But they identified themselves as Christian. They just didn't like the Christianity of their time very much. But there's been one Catholic president, and he got shot. That was Kennedy. So there's a long-standing fear, and it even emerged this year in 2012, when you have a vice presidential nominee who identifies as Catholic. And a lot of religious groups are not very happy about that ticket, about that combination of the president and vice presidential nominees. For whatever reasons, I don't really understand, but they don't talk about wanting to bring their religion into their official policy ideas, but there's that fear still going around. And because a lot of Irish go to work for city governments, they become the clerks and the policemen and the firemen and whatnot. They start trying to form unions. So the union movement becomes very heavily identified with Irish, and because Irish are untrustworthy, therefore union movements become untrustworthy. And then when Marxism starts to spread, you get a combination of if you're a pro-union person, then you're probably also a communist, and so there's a lot of attacks against union movements in the U.S. in the 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s, directly accused of being communist revolutionaries who want to overthrow the U.S. government. Because that's what Marx talked about, overthrow the capitalist governments and build something new. So, questions about the Irish at all? A lot of this kind of racism also permeated, say, German communities who would move into the Midwest and they would form their little towns. I mean, there are towns in the Midwest called Bismarck, which was a German leader. I mean, they're named after German words sometimes. So there are these kind of cultural enclaves, not just in the big cities of the East, but the small rural farming towns that get created in the Midwest, often run with German newspapers or Irish newspapers or Italian newspapers. They stuck together in their communities. And they tried to bring their family members over from the home country, as many immigrants tend to do. They're also untrustworthy, a lot of Americans thought, because they come over with political ideas that have been ingrained in them from an early age. Basically, they've been socialized to believe certain things politically that could be damaging to the United States, but also damaging to democracy. A lot of these immigrants are coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, places that are still run by kings. Most of Europe is still run by kings into the early 1900s. Britain had more of a democratic system. France had more of a democratic system. voting rights and representative politics, parliaments and congresses. But those living in Eastern and Southern Europe were largely dominated by kings, completely. The big empires that will fight World War I. So an American theory is that if these immigrants come in being taught that monarchy, all that kind of stuff is best, then they might not be good enough democracy supporters to be allowed to vote, because they'll vote badly. They'll vote for monarchists and authoritarians rather than, good American politicians who believe in democracy and freedom and whatnot. And of course, a lot of people who hated Karl Marx and everything he stood for label Karl Marx as an anarchist, because a lot of people are coming over with feeling like the victims of capitalism. If they talk about communism, they are labeled anarchists themselves. And the basic demand that a lot of Americans make is that if you come into the United States, you should learn to speak English, you should assimilate with American culture, and what historians often call Americanize yourself. Go into American society, become part of it. Don't try to remain separate, and don't try to change it. Because there's a lot of cultural superiority ideas going on, especially in the United States. And a lot of these American nativists who believe that the kind of white American citizen culture is better than anything else do not like it when these immigrants go into cities and they stick in their own little communities and speak their own languages and celebrate their own cultural heritage. And they hate it when they go off into the Midwest and create their own towns with foreign-sounding names and keep their communities together, and often refuse to speak English. So there's a lot of racism and a lot of kind of political hatred going on. So a lot of these immigrants are often just not allowed to vote sometimes, and they're identified as outside the American people. They're outsiders. They can only become American and protected by American laws if they assimilate into American culture. So there's a deep building hatred, and they start identifying the wave after wave of immigrants coming to the United States as the major problem for U.S. society. They're the ones bringing disease and debauchery and poverty and economic problems to the United States. It's not like the United States created these problems itself, because the U.S. economy is supposedly perfect. And U.S. politics, you'll even see in the presidential kind of conventions and debates, they'll go with the idea that the United States is the greatest country ever built, has the most perfect political system ever built. And that's a general theory in American politics. One of the major symbols of New York City and the ideas of basic freedom in the United States is the Statue of Liberty, was donated by France as a celebration of freedom. And they put it out in New York Harbor as a kind of welcome sign for people who want to come to the United States, that they will be welcomed, they will be accepted. And the poem that they eventually bolt onto the bottom of the thing advertises the idea that anyone who wants to come to the United States will be accepted, and it will be treated with equality and fairness and be given the opportunity that all peoples are entitled to. So they literally say that this very tall woman standing in the harbor, that is the first image that a lot of people coming in on the boats into New York City ever see before they see the skyline. It's literally kind of out there in the water on an island. They say that this woman is saying to these people coming in, and saying to the rest of the world, here's where the quote begins: "Keep ancient lands your storied pomp," telling the monarchs and the rich people of the world, you can keep all your luxuries, you can keep all your power in your own countries. We don't want any of that. We don't want any of your rich people coming to the United States. Instead, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Which means, send me the crap of your country. The people who don't want to be there, who feel like they are victimized, who feel they have no opportunity. who are starving. Send these, the homeless, the tempest-tossed, which means the storm, the hurricane-tossed people who are victimized. Send them to me. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, all your extra people that you don't want and who don't want to be there, send them to the United States and we will welcome them. So it's a promise to the world. The United States is supposed to be a place for immigrants. It was built by immigrants and the desperate. And that this is what makes it a great country. But once they get there, they are largely victimized and they are looked down upon. And you have a lot of anti-immigrant laws that are passed and are still being proposed today. And this thing still is on the Statue of Liberty today. And as one of my favorite comedians said, if you're not going to actually do it, maybe you should take that thing off. Don't make promises you're not willing to keep. So, questions about that at all?
You said it was a gift from France.
The statue was a gift from France, but the poem was written by a lady who lived in New York. So they bolt on the poem afterward. But it's still there. And it's a very famous saying throughout the world. That America is the land of opportunity, right? That this is where poor people should go to build themselves up, to build wealth and prosperity for themselves. That this is an equal, open opportunity type place. Once you get here, maybe a different story.